Good morning, UIC, and welcome. Welcome to the 2016 Integritas Institute for Ethics Business Ethics Symposium, The Power of Story in Business Ethics. We're going to begin shortly with an invocation from Bishop Perry, who will join me on the stage. But I wanted to welcome you on behalf of the St. John Paul II Catholic Newman Center on campus and the Newman Catholic Student Association, who are co-sponsoring this event along with Relevant Radio. We've recruited a very fine group of speakers today and panelists that should make this day very interesting. I want to thank you, students, especially for selling out this event. So we had to cut off the registrations last night at 170, which is over the capacity of the room. So we're expecting a full crowd at lunch, and we want you to enjoy the breakfast here. So, Your Excellency, would you like to come up and do the invocation, and then I'll introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Shorts. Good morning, one and all. Let's bow our heads and ask the Lord's blessing upon our event today. As we stand poised for the miracle of springtime covering the earth with a tapestry of beauty, show us, O Lord, that history has its resurrections, that springtime follows winter, day follows night, and out of travail comes the birth of better days. In these days when most news is bad news, save us, Lord, from a cynical pessimism by the radiant belief that times of sorrow are not the end of history, but the time to assess enduring values. May no disappointment lead to despair, no failure extinguish the bright light of hope. Equip us for the role we must play in the making of a better world. Thus, in this gathering today, may the words of our mouths, the thoughts of our minds, the ideas exchanged, the inspiration of speakers, the emotions of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. In the spirit of the servant, Lord, help us to go about our tasks doing good, healing our broken humanity, binding up the wounds of those who suffer, restoring right relations with our fellow man, and doing all in our wisdom and power to bring that day of thy kingdom. We pray in his name, who was servant of all. Amen.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Bishop Perry. Bishop Perry is the vicar of Vicariate 6, which is located on the south side substantially of Chicago, and we very much appreciate his attendance here. He's also the convener of the board of the Integritas Institute. And let me just give you a little bit more information on the Integritas Institute for Ethics. It is a department of the St. John Paul Catholic Newman Center, the Catholic chaplaincy here on campus, and was founded in 1997 by Father Pat Marshall, who's sitting in the rear with the bishop, and a number of leaders in ethics. I think Nick Lund-Melfis was around at that point. And each year we've tried to add a dimension to the campus life by sponsoring a number of different events and speakers. We have a business ethics conference, which you're attending today. We also have a bioethics conference coming up in April, on April 6th, on the West Campus. And there'll be separate announcements about that. But one of our tasks is to bring to the campus a dialogue on the values that are part of our tradition. And to many of you, those values are common sense values in terms of justice for people in their work, in terms of the right use of property, in terms of truthfulness, and truth in terms of honesty that form the groundwork for business ethics as its practice. Today we're very privileged to have two significant thinkers and philosophers here this morning. One is Christopher Michelson, who is the David A. and Barbara Koch Distinguished Professor of Business Ethics and Social Responsibility, Associate Professor Ethics and Business Law at the University of St. Thomas Opus College of Business. He also has a role at NYU, and for a number of years has been an ethics practitioner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he can tell us more about his work there. I do want to clarify, it is David A. and Barbara Koch. That is not David H. Koch, who's one of the Koch brothers. So this is not that. We're just going to clarify that right up front so we don't get the Koch brother question, and it is pronounced differently. If you saw Young Frankenstein, the movie, you know, there was Frankenstein. He always called himself Frankenstein to differentiate. And the Koch family were well-known philanthropists in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area, very generous to the University of St. Thomas. So just to clarify that, I get that off in the beginning. What fascinated me about Professor Michelson, I was searching the web for interesting business ethics folks last summer when we were setting this up. And I searched and found Professor Michelson giving a paper, I believe, on literature and business ethics. And I thought, that's our guy. He'll come at it from a different angle and really bring the humanities into discussion with business ethics and still get at the practical level. And I'm very pleased that he accepted our invitation. I think I shocked you, Christopher, when I first contacted you, but I'm a little bit of a talent scout, so that's how that happened. Professor Michelson is going to be joined by Professor Maria Schachtman, who is a full professor here at UIC in the Department of Philosophy and Associate Dean in the UIC College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I've read a little of Professor Schachtman's work. I want to mention, by the way, just some housekeeping things. The UIC bookstore is in the back. So a number of the books that pertain to our speakers, or previous and present, are there at the bookstore table for your perusal. And there are some other organizations that I'll mention, the National Center for the Laity and also the Newman Catholic Student Association, in case you are interested in signing up for that. Professor Schachtman has quite a range of study from neurobiology to practical ethics to the constitution of the person, and maybe she'll have a chance to explain that to you. And also, she's got a new book out that's in the back that I've been reading, and it's very interesting on the person and the self. So you may want to take a look at that book as well. Professor Schachtman will be responding to Professor Michelson. So I'm going to stop it there and ask Professor Michelson to stand up here and give us his presentation. And thank you very much.
Good morning. Obviously, I'm not too slick with technology. I'm just starting a timer to make sure that I don't go over time, and it takes me a minute to get this all together. I want to thank Albert for the invitation to be here. I want to thank the Integritas Institute and all of you for showing up. You may ask me questions about the Koch brothers. I just don't know them personally. We can talk about anything you'd like to talk about. Actually, I was on an airplane, a flight from LaGuardia to Minneapolis last week, and somebody did ask me a question about the Koch brothers. I was sitting down it was a very late flight, and this guy who appeared and sounded quite inebriated sat in the seat next to me, and started up a conversation with me. He was very uninhibited, and he said, "Should I read this book or should I read this book?" And it was a book about the Koch brothers or a work of fiction by Thomas Pynchon. And I told him, well, the first book might make you ill, so read the second book. Read the Pynchon. He took my advice, and he didn't get ill. He did fall asleep on the flight. Anyway, that expresses my partiality toward stories. It also might express something about my politics, or it might not. I believe in democratic dialogue, but I appreciate Albert clarifying that actually David A. Koch is different from David H. Koch. And part of the reason that that's important is that the labels that we put on people tell stories about them. And we can infer things from the stories that we tell about them. So it's important to tell the right kind of story. There's a session going on next door, I think it's that direction, on Ponzi schemes. Interesting that there are two business ethics sessions going on side by side. Theirs is much more practical. Ponzi schemes have to be stopped. They are things that can have negative impacts on those who participate in them and those, of course, who invest in them. And sometimes we focus so much on those specific ills that need to be stopped that we fail to actually reflect and think about our fundamental values. So they're doing things in that room that are going to be useful today. I think the things that we talk about in this room, stories, they may not be useful today, but they'll be useful someday. And maybe in the large scheme of things, they'll be more useful in defining and shaping our values. And we don't often get time to do that in business. You know, I'm especially excited to talk about the power of the story in business ethics because it's a topic that I care deeply about. I'm just not sure how many other people care about it. The event flyer described me as, quote, the business ethics practitioner and professor who advises CEOs to read novels, which is completely true. But that doesn't mean that they actually take my advice. My students take my advice. My students take my advice about what novels to read. In fact, I have students in Minneapolis today who, in my absence, are discussing one of the books that I'm going to talk about today. But they take my advice, in part at least, because they have to. If a CEO takes my advice and reads novels, it's because they want to. Because they believe, as I hope that you'll be persuaded today, that reading stories will actually make them better business persons. But I'm a realist. You can be comfortable being honest with me. I'm curious to know how many of you are here because you feel like you have to be, that there's some sort of credit riding on it, or because you want to be. So show of hands, how many of you are here because you have to be? See, I said you could be honest. It's okay, a good share. And how many because you want to be? Well, that's nice. That's not what I expected. Actually, more that want to be here than have to be here. You know, this is a contrast. It's a contrast in moral motivation that in the practice of business ethics we often talk about. It's a contrast between carrots and sticks. And you might ask, what's the best way to bring about responsible business behavior? With a promise of rewards for good behavior or the promise of punishment for bad behavior? The conventional wisdom in practice is that it's a combination of the two. That the right the right mix of reward and punishment will effect desired compliance. And there are examples of that working in practice. So this image depicts a horse that is being motivated by both a carrot and a stick. And the carrot, in the case of the United States Federal Sentencing Guidelines, is this. When an organization is prosecuted for criminal misbehavior, the guidelines provide discretion in sentencing. If the organization cooperated with investigators, self-reported, took reasonable steps to prevent and detect misconduct, their fine could be modified by a culpability score multiplier that could turn a fine into 1/20th of that fine. Whereas if an organization failed to cooperate with investigators, didn't self-report, and didn't take reasonable steps to prevent and detect wrongdoing, that fine could increase by a factor of 4. So if you do the math, that's a swing of 1 to 80. That's a pretty significant carrot and stick. And the first few years of my professional career actually consisted of advising client organizations about how to regulate carrots and sticks to affect good behavior. It was my dream job at the time. It was helping business, which I believe has the potential to make the world a better place, avoid doing those things that sometimes lead us to believe that business also has the potential to make the world a little worse. But then 14 years ago, after a few years in the practice of business ethics, I was offered another dream job to teach this stuff to students at the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School. And they were just opening a new building called Huntsman Hall, which at the time was the most technologically advanced building I'd ever been in. Even though I worked in a New York consultancy, the conference rooms at the office couldn't hold a candle to the classrooms in Huntsman Hall. And even though I had all this technology at my fingertips, the students were just packed in. They were shoulder to shoulder. And I remember when I was giving my first exam, I worried that some students might cheat. And I actually worried a little bit more. Not so much that students might cheat, but that these being competitive Wharton business students, that they might accuse other students of cheating. And so I had to have a way of regulating the accusations and the behavior. And so I used it as an opportunity to teach them a little bit about carrots and sticks. I said, listen, I trust you to do the right thing, not to use your neighbor's answers in order to influence your own. But at the same time, I have this technology at my fingertips. I'm going to turn the classroom cameras on. And by the way, they're taking photos of you from every angle. And if I do receive an accusation, I'll be able to review the tape and figure out whether the cheating actually happened. In 3 years there, I never once got a complaint about students cheating. But one reason that I stayed in academia and I just keep a foot in practice is that while I think that not cheating, complying with the rules, I think that's desirable behavior, but I don't consider the absence of cheating fully to constitute ethical behavior. I think it's about more than just that. If you think about it, the carrot and stick analogy sets a pretty low bar for achievement and promotes a pretty grim view of human behavior, that we can be manipulated like horses can. In the words of philosophers, the motivational force of carrots and sticks has instrumental value. They condition us to do or not do things out of utility, and that which has value in this world is that which is useful, according to that view. And in that vein, you'll hear some stories about stories and their instrumental value. They can be useful as instruments for conditioning the right kinds of behavior. But if that were all you got out of today's conference about stories, I think it wouldn't be as enlightening a day as it could be. What I really use stories for in my teaching and research is actually to cultivate appreciation for a different kind of value, what philosophers sometimes call intrinsic value, that which is good in itself, regardless of its usefulness. We might read stories because they're useful, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we hopefully also read stories irrespective of their usefulness because they're beautiful, because they're good. And business performance measures sometimes have trouble with that. They can place the value on instrumental usefulness, but they have trouble valuing the beautiful and the good with a capital G. And if you think about it, for that matter, Many of the most important things in life defy measurement. So do think about that for a minute. Think about the most important things in life. Can they be measured in terms of numbers, in terms of money? Does anybody want to share an example of something that perhaps can't?
Well, one easy example is a family photo of a past experience that you had with, your immediate family on a trip.
Beautiful. And you hear my response, beautiful, right? It's beautiful.
I mean, besides whatever you would pay for the photograph to be processed, it has value because it has long-lasting value. You remember it and appreciate it that time that you were together.
It's worth a lot more than the cost of the photo itself.
Right.
Yeah. And it also represents some of those other good things in life that other people might be thinking of, but they're too shy to say. So thank you, sir. People are thinking about love, right? They're thinking about happiness. And they're thinking about maybe art sometimes is imperfectly valued by the market. Lots of things that we live for don't necessarily have a monetary value. By the way, this doesn't just happen in business. That business has trouble valuating these things. I think my microphone just went off. There, we're back. We're back. It also happens in education. So I haven't had enough of a tour of this campus to know this, but in many universities, University of Pennsylvania included, University of St. Thomas where I am now, New York University where I also teach, the business buildings are typically the most well-equipped, sometimes the most expensive, sometimes the newest. Does it sound okay, John?
Yeah, I think
yeah?
just in the back there. But
okay.
I'll get it.
Okay, good. Sorry. And part of the reason that the business buildings are so well equipped is that they're so well funded, because the alumni of those business schools may have made the most money, and so they donate the most to those schools. And as funding for the liberal arts decreases, we see a corresponding increase in funding for the STEM disciplines. And I have nothing against the STEM disciplines, by the way, but I myself majored in philosophy, and it was probably an economic mistake at the time. But it was one of the best mistakes I ever made. Today, I teach business students, and I don't try and persuade them to major in philosophy, but I do try and persuade them to explore how they can do meaningful work through business, not just materially rewarding work. One of the ways in which stories can be useful to us is that they can remind us of their own intrinsic value, the worthiness of some perfectly useless, but nevertheless indispensable things. If you took it to an extreme, a world in which the only valuable things were useful things would be really a world devoid of inspiration. In short, business ethics narrowly is about avoiding irresponsible behavior, but the power of the story in business ethics is that it might also cultivate a more well-rounded view of value and of the good life that business can help us to achieve. One important value that I think that stories and art in general can teach us is that there are ends in life that should be pursued for their own sake, not just because they're profitable and useful. And in a world in which bottom lines are financial and relative success is measured in economic terms, it can sometimes be easy to forget that. But at the same time, it's important to realize that part of the power of the story in business ethics is instrumental. Aristotle claimed that stories, dramatic poetry, had instrumental value of helping to cultivate our moral sensibility. And I'll give you an example of that. In the first book of Theodore Dreiser's Trilogy of Desire, The Financier, there's a story that illustrates the power of the story in business ethics. The narrator describes young Frank Cooperwood, who's the main character, the financier, starts out the book as a child, as when he's 10 years old, forever pondering, the narrator repeats twice to reinforce that he's pondering how life was organized. His father was, the narrator tells us, not destined to be a great financier. This is Frank's father. His father was marked out to be a moderately successful one. The father was cautious, the soul of caution, the narrator says, worried about from whom he borrowed money, to whom he lent it, reserved about expressing his political views, lest they differ from those of his clients and coworkers. And as I read this, I think his father was sort of the anti-Trump. So Frank's observing his conservative father and his religious mother, and he resolves at age 10 that he's going to work on Philadelphia's 3rd Street like his father, but unlike his father, he resolves to win, not just be moderately successful. And so at the fish market near the Cooperwood home one day, store owners place a lobster and a squid in a clear tank. And I'm going to read at length from this passage because I think it really illustrates the power of the story. So here it goes. One day he saw a squid and a lobster put in the tank, and in connection with them was witness to a tragedy which stayed with him all his life and cleared things up considerably intellectually. The lobster, it appeared from the talk of the idle bystanders, was offered no food, as the squid was considered his rightful prey. He lay at the bottom of the clear glass tank on the yellow sand, apparently seeing nothing. You could not tell in which way his beady black buttons of eyes were looking, but apparently they were never off the body of the squid. The latter, pale and waxy in texture, looking very much like pork fat or jade, moved about in torpedo fashion, but his movements were apparently never out of the eyes of his enemy. For by degrees, portions of his body began to disappear, snapped off by the relentless claws of his pursuer. Fascinated by the drama, young Cooperwood came daily to watch. One evening he returned, and lo, the expected had happened. There was a little crowd around the tank. The lobster was in the corner. Before him was the squid, cut in two and partially devoured. The incident made a great impression on him. It answered in a rough way that riddle which had been annoying him so much in the past. How is life organized? Things lived on each other. That was it. End quote. I can't recommend The Financier as a beautiful work of literature, but I can recommend it as a useful one. It probably doesn't spoil anything for me to tell you that Frank becomes a rather unscrupulous businessman. He actually, I just learned that your mascot is the Flames. He actually makes a lot of money and then also experiences a lot of turmoil because of the Chicago fire. I assigned the book to my corporate responsibility and ethics students at Wharton in the fall of 2002. That was my first semester as a full-time professor because Enron was news. Frank reminded me of the chief financial officer of Enron, Andy Fastow, and Wharton was in Philadelphia, where Frank lived. Today I only assign chapter 1 to my students. That contains the lobster and squid because that's the best thing in the novel as far as I'm concerned. But I do think that this passage I've just read is useful to our ability to think about the kinds of lives we ought to lead, the kinds of people that we ought to be. I'd like you to think about, who would you rather be, a lobster or a squid? Or suppose that you could choose to take on the characteristics of any animal for the purpose of succeeding in business. What animal would it be? That's a question to you. Does anybody want to share? What animal would they be to succeed in business?
I would say a lion.
A lion, did you say?
Yeah.
And could you say why?
Because they go after what they want, their prey, you know?
It's the lobster of the savannah, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we've got a young Frank Cooperwood here, don't we? Yeah? I'm going to tell you, I thought about this myself. I would like to be a monkey for a few reasons. First of all, I was born in the year of the monkey, and this is the year of the monkey, if you don't know. I'm half Chinese, recently celebrated Chinese New Year. And I've been told since I was a child that monkeys have high ambition. They're very creative. Those seem like good characteristics. Sometimes the implication is maybe a little manipulative. But I've also recently learned from primatologists like Franz de Waal that monkeys also exhibit a behavior called reciprocity, where they do understand the value of doing things for others, in part because if they scratch somebody else's back, they'll get their own back scratched, but also in part because they believe in notions of fairness. That if I get a grape for performing a task and you get a cucumber, that somehow you've been treated unfairly. And some experiments have shown monkeys sharing grapes with recipients of cucumbers, believe it or not. So I hope your lion is as kind as my monkey, sir. But you can see through this discussion at least some of the power of the story in business ethics. Frank learns how to do business by observing the lobster and the squid, and we reflect on how to do business by reading Frank's story. He imposes a story on what he's seen. His story is things live on each other. Aristotle goes on to say that the lessons of poetry are universals. The lessons of history are singulars. And I think what he means by that is that Frank is living in history, and he sees one possible outcome, the lobster devouring the squid, a winner and a loser. And that's sometimes how we are led and how Frank is led to think about business. But let's imagine another story, because that's what stories enable us to do. Let's imagine a story where the lobster and the squid partner together. They become a flying circus entertainment act within their aquarium. And they draw observers, just as many observers as the contest between them draws. And this flying circus act is sustainable, whereas the contest is unsustainable. One of them is going to lose, the contest is going to end. If they remain a flying circus, they can attract customers to the store over and over and over, and they'll get fed by the store owner. I know that's a silly example, but think about what happens to the lobster after he finishes his meal of squid. Yell this one out. We don't even need a microphone. What happens to the lobster after he's done eating the squid? Sorry, louder? Looking for more and not finding it, and getting eaten himself. He becomes your dinner, right? By the way, it's important to note that not all theorists agree with Aristotle that dramatic poetry cultivates moral character. Aristotle's mentor, Plato, was wary of imitation in general, including acting in fiction. He contended that it was a form of copying. It was irrational and engenders a false sense of knowledge. I remember when I was a graduate student reading literature that one of my Platonic elders said to me that novels are for people who haven't lived long enough. And the esteemed literary critic Harold Bloom, who has promoted the inherent importance of the Western canon to shaping our culture, he insists, nevertheless, that reading literature does not make us better citizens. And you can probably think of some of your most well-read friends and acquaintances who are not the very best people. And for that matter, if you think about authors and artists and actors, some of them are infamous for living their lives in a way that lacks the kind of prudence and self-regulation that Aristotle admired. This is all to suggest that if stories have the power over our minds to teach us how to be better people, they could also influence us to be worse people. I've never done this before, but I actually recently quit reading a book. The main character was so crabby, I found myself being crabby after I'd read the book. So I understand how they can make us worse people. But I also believe that if we use stories intentionally, they don't just magically make us better people, but they can engender the kind of reflection and thinking that can cultivate our moral character in good ways. And increasingly, the psychology of stories is teaching us that this is possible. So I'm going to test your knowledge with a series of true, false questions. The first one is this. Human beings are natural storytellers. True or false? How many say true? How many say false? The vast majority of you say that we are natural storytellers because you've experienced it. It is true. In fact, storytelling is part of what it is to be human. It is like water to a fish, according to Jonathan Gottschall, the author of a book called The Storytelling Animal. Next item, stories figuratively transport us into narrative worlds. So you get this sense of being in a different place. You may know that you're not in a different place, but still you get the feeling of being in a different place. How many of you think it's true that stories can enable transportation? False? Most of you raised your hands again there too, and it's because you've had that experience of being transported. And if you are transported, the story is more likely to have an effect upon you. Do stories elicit empathy? True, stories elicit empathy? False? Again, you're right. But that empathy is only really elicited if you are transported into the story. I remember as a graduate student reading an article about how can we feel for the fate of Anna Karenina. Why do we cry when we read stories? Why do we get nervous that something bad is going to happen to a character we like when we know they're fictional? It's because of this transportation effect. It's because of this eliciting of empathy. And as a result, I'm going to give this one to you. Stories can also cultivate emotional intelligence. They can support our ability to adapt to evolving circumstances. How about this one? A psychological study done recently tested whether after reading stories, people were more likely to cooperate with others on a task. How many of you believe it's true that this experiment showed that stories actually correlate with cooperative behavior? How many believe that's false? By now you should know, sir, in the back, the one person who raised his hand that is false, that all of these items that I'm sharing with you are true. That's amazing, though, that people actually were more likely to cooperate after reading stories than the control group that was not. Stories also improve theory of mind, our ability to relate to other people. Now, 7 straight true ones. I'm going to let you guess about this one. Does reading better stories make us, are better stories better at making us better people? Are better stories better at making us better people than bad stories? Whatever your definition of better and bad is. How many people think it is true reading better stories is better at making us better people? How many think it's false? This, for the first time, more people thought something was false. This one has more tenuous evidence, but the evidence is that actually this too is true. Reading better stories is better at making us better people. I mean, if you take all that research together, that's pretty amazing. That seems to create a pretty strong case that stories can, when they're used intentionally for that purpose, make us better people, make us better business people, and that better stories are better at making us better business people. Tongue twister for you. Because some of these moral capabilities, like cooperation, ability to relate to others, emotional intelligence, empathy, even the ability to tell a good story, those are beneficial to management in general, not just to moral management. For example, advertising sells stories. They appeal often to the emotions. I don't know if you can read This graph at the bottom of the page, it compares the Dow Jones Sustainability Index to the Dow Jones Industrial Average for a 10-year period. Although I've seen different versions of this comparison, this one strongly suggests that socially responsible companies either outperform or don't underperform companies in general. And though there's no definitive evidence of that, there is increasing speculation that at least being responsible doesn't harm performance. And you can see in this ad for a soap that this company is selling a story about helping hygiene and how hygiene saves lives. So if you buy the idea that stories can make us better business people, better in the sense of being more ethical, better in the sense of just being more successful, there remains the question of which stories should we be reading. So I'm going to recommend a few stories to you, and then I'm going to ask you to think about your own recommendations to me, to us. My first recommendation is a book called The Reluctant Fundamentalist by the Pakistani author Mohsin Hamid. In my view, this is the first great post-9/11 novel about post-9/11 capitalism. It's a conversation between a character named Chunges, who's a young strategy consultant who leaves his job in the United States to return home to Lahore, Pakistan. And he's talking with you. The book is written in the second person, so as the reader, you are the person he's conversing with. And you're a business visitor to Lahore, there on an uncertain mission. After overcoming the odds to earn a scholarship at Princeton, Chunges accepts an offer from a patrician American consultancy, seemingly making his adoption of his new country and its capitalism complete. He specializes in business valuation, but as he finds out over the course of the novel, sometimes the valuation that he's doing is used just as an excuse to cut costs, to lay off employees. While he's visiting a client out of the country, he sees television footage of the World Trade Center towers falling on 9/11, and he cracks a smile. It's a stunning moment in the book when he smiles about that, and he describes a sense of perplexity at his involuntary reaction. It just automatically came to him that way, and he observes, I was the product of an American university. I was earning a lucrative American salary. I was in love with an American woman. That episode, along with the conversation that he's having with you about the meat that you're eating, about predator and prey, raises a question about predator and prey. Are terrorists predators? Are they justified in their view of the United States as a predator? Later on, Chunges gives up his expense account and his salary to return home as a college teacher. Has he left behind his predatory behavior, or is he actually fomenting anti-American sentiment? Are you and Chunges enjoying a social meal together, or are you each plotting to kill the other? The Reluctant Fundamentalist raises all these questions without answering them, inviting us to imagine, in Aristotle's words, things such as might happen, and to consider what is our role? What is the role of business in perpetuating or resolving extreme income inequality? With a variation on the hypothesis that we're discussing, that the stories we read shape our conceptions of what capitalism is and is for, I brought an idea to the World Economic Forum a few years ago. The World Economic Forum hosts 2 annual meetings, among others, but 2 international annual meetings, one in Davos, Switzerland, which is affectionately known as Davos, and an annual meeting of new champions in China. And they have programming on several tracks: technology, science, economics, environment. One of the tracks is arts and culture. And traditionally, the arts and culture track had sort of been the spouse track, meaning the CEOs attend the hard stuff, the economics and technology. The spouses take yoga classes and Shakespeare classes. And I proposed to them that they actually try and connect one of these arts and culture track events to business, that they ask the question, what are CEOs reading? I was curious, for example, whether the rebalancing of the global economy was having an impact on what books CEOs read in order to understand global capitalism, whether waning Western economic dominance was corresponding with waning Western cultural hegemony. We've heard for years that China's GDP will surpass that of the United States in a matter of years, and that the BRIC markets, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, were the growth of the future. And so you can imagine that the influence of cultural objects, books from those markets, might also start to infiltrate the reading of CEOs. Here are a couple of examples of what I affectionately call brick lit. This book on the left, The Wanda Way, is a management bestseller in China. It's just been released in England. It's not available in the United States. The book on the right, do you recognize a resemblance? That's my uncle. My uncle has written a best-selling management book in Brazil. It's now in its 14th printing in Portuguese. It's never been translated into English, but these are the kinds of issues that I hope a deep discussion of CEOs' reading preferences might lead to in 2010 in the Davos session that was ultimately called Reading Leaders' Minds. And the question prompt for the panelists was, what classic and contemporary books shape the personal and professional values of today's leaders? And on the panel, CEOs talked a little bit about their childhood reading. But for me, the most interesting outcome was that they talked very little about stories. I thought they would talk about novels. They didn't. They talked about and coalesced on 4 classics of business literature. 4 classics of business literature that had shaped the narrative of capitalism and had come to be by the early 21st century. What do you think they were? These 4 so-called classics of business literature. I'll give you a hint. You're not likely to consider any of them to be actual literature. I'll give you more hints until I see a hand go up. One is a work of economics. I see a hand over there.
Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith.
That's the work of economics, yes. Very good, 1 for 1. Anybody want to guess what the book on military strategy might have been, or what the work of biology might have been, work of political theory? There's a hand over there.
The Art of War, Sun Tzu.
Sun Tzu's The Art of War, yes, was another classic of business literature. You know, the 4 books turned out to be The Wealth of Nations, The Art of War, The Origin of Species, and The Prince, Machiavelli's The Prince. Now, few business people, or the rest of us for that matter, including me until we did this study, have actually read these books, in part because they don't capture our imaginations in the way that stories do. We do have stories about these books, though. And some of them are inaccurate stories. In 20th century capitalism, for example, we believed incorrectly that The Wealth of Nations promotes the amoral pursuit of self-interest, not recognizing that actually before he was a famous economist, Adam Smith was a well-known moral philosopher who wrote a book, among others, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. We believed that The Origin of Species permits animalistic behavior in the name of survival, even though its author didn't coin the phrase survival of the fittest, and even though now we know that some animals believe in fairness and reciprocity. We have a story that is better to be feared than loved as a leader, in accordance with Machiavelli's advice. Even though, although it seems not to be this way sometimes, we live in less violent, less retributive times than Machiavelli did. And we describe business as though it's war, even though military strategy, according to the author of The Art of War, is better to avoid combat than to engage in combat. From that panel, I concluded that not only were CEOs reading the wrong stories, but they also needed to read more stories, and that these stories had to resonate with 21st century global capitalism. So I have another recommendation for you. Albert alluded to it earlier when he alluded to the film Young Frankenstein. Well, that and a legion of other films came from this incredibly fertile book by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And the way I read this book as relevant to 21st century global capitalism, even though most of us think of it as a monster story, is that it's really a book about its creator. It's about the creator of the monster, whose name is actually Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein. It's a story about how its creator turned the monster into a monster by neglecting its effects on the world after it had been created. It's the story of technology gone awry, how building a living thing from lifeless parts inflicted unintended consequences upon the world. It's the story today of big data and how the promise of consumer technology has left us with the unintended consequences of privacy violations. We can only get the good if we also attend to the bad that our creations can do. It's the story of genetically modified organisms and how the drive to higher agricultural production has also led us to controversy about the safety of the food supply. It's the story of industrialization in general, how the pursuit of economic growth has led to such problems as excessive inequality and irreversible climate change. As this slide shows, there's an unmistakable connection between industrialization and wealth creation. I'm from Minnesota, and so in Minnesota we call these hockey stick graphs because, of course, as you may know, Minnesota is the state of hockey, even though the Chicago Blackhawks are the defending Stanley Cup champions. I see a fist in back. We like winners. Anyway, there is this unmistakable connection between industrialization and economic growth, but left untended, economic growth can have and create global risks that give rise to moral questions. How much inequality is too much inequality? Should developed countries bear or share the cost burden of climate change mitigation and adaptation? What's more important, the quantity or the quality of the food supply? What's the proper balance between big data, privacy, and security? So as I said before, I'd like us to have a conversation about what stories belong among the stories of future capitalism. Before we get to that discussion, I'd just like to take stock of where we've been and give you a glimpse of a few more stories among many on a list that I've started to compile. So we have established that there's an important view that stories, including and perhaps especially novels, can be instrumentally valuable to shaping moral character. They can teach us, for example, that to succeed in business, we have to vanquish the competition, or they can teach us that to succeed in business, we have to be fair to the competition. We've seen that the classics of business literature that we've inherited tend to promote self-interested, combative, manipulative, and survivalist behaviors. We've intimated that the view of capitalism that we've inherited has enhanced our collective wealth while also exacerbating inequality and other seemingly intractable problems of capitalism that require morality to solve. We've seen evidence from the psychology of stories that they can transport us into other worlds, and that when they do, we cultivate the ability to relate to other people, to adapt to circumstances, to engage in cooperative behavior, to exercise emotional intelligence, and to exercise other abilities that are not only moral, but also managerial assets. We've looked at a couple of stories that I claim can, when used intentionally for the purpose of reflecting on business ethics, teach us to be better business persons, better in the sense of being more moral and also more successful. The Reluctant Fundamentalist encourages us to confront the causes and consequences of power and economic relations between people and nations. And Frankenstein leads us to consider the unintended consequences of technological progress. Not only are these two novels topically relevant to future capitalism, they're also written by authors, or they're about characters who represent the diversity of capitalist actors in the future. Not just the white male canon of the past that dominated both the humanities and business in the last century. Not coincidentally, these two novels are not only relevant to future capitalism and instrumentally valuable in that regard, but also they are timeless works of intrinsically valuable art. The Reluctant Fundamentalist was shortlisted for the 2007 Booker Prize, one of the most prestigious literature awards, and Frankenstein is the 5th most widely read text on college campuses today. By the way, not incidentally, Machiavelli's The Prince is 8th, according to the Open Syllabus Project. The Wealth of Nations is 37th, and Aristotle's Poetics is 42nd. After the Davos experiment, I concluded not only that business persons, from CEOs to business students, needed more stories, and they also needed good ones relevant to the 21st century, that were also not prohibitively long for busy business schedules. And so I embarked on a project to identify classics of business literature that might also be stories of future capitalism. Descriptively, those are stories that shape our capitalist values of how to do business and why. And they also reflect the capitalism that we've inherited. They had to be long enough for the reader to become emotionally and imaginatively invested, but not so long that they couldn't be read on 1 or 2 business trips. They had to be classics, or if they were too new to be declared classics, they had to have received positive critical attention. And no less important, they had to have direct or allegorical relevance to 21st century global capitalism and its diversity of cultures and participants and issues. Together, these simple criteria, length, relevance, and quality, have been remarkably difficult to satisfy. I've now been at this, not with all my time, but it's been at least on the back burner and sometimes on the front burner. I've been researching this topic for more than 5 years now. And I've had to read a lot of books in order to construct a list. And I haven't read everything on my list at this point because I'm a slow reader, unfortunately. That's why I ask for help from people like you. Here are a few more books on my list. I won't talk at length about these, but I'll just recommend them to you as stories of future capitalism. None of them satisfy all 3 of my criteria of length, relevance, and quality, but they all satisfy at least 2 of them. One is Dave Eggers' The Circle, a book that sort of takes the technology and transparency and privacy and security debate to an extreme conclusion. One of them is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, a fantasy story about the lengths people might go to protect assets that they have lucked into, such as diamonds as big as the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. A book that I sometimes pair with The Diamond as Big as the Ritz is Abdelrahman Munif's Cities of Salt. That's a book about oil exploration in the Middle East. And again, like The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, the effects that some people might go to hoard and consolidate, control over assets. And then Zadie Smith's The Embassy of Cambodia, one of my favorite new books, which is about the ambiguity of immigrant workers and the dividing line between what is and what is not slavery. My list is now 67 books long, and I'm about to post it publicly as a Google Doc that I'll consider to be a living document. The contributions to the list have come from presentations that I've made around the world. They've come from business scholars, they've come from comparative literature scholars, from colleagues, from students, from book reviews, and from big data syllabus searches. I've not read every one of the 67 stories, and I'm not sure that I will, because I'll admit sometimes I mistake the means for the end. The means is to find stories for the list, but the end is to celebrate great stories for their intrinsic value, because stories make us human. And sometimes our instrumental goals to make a long list can distract us from our humanity. So in the end, I'm here to talk about great books, great stories, stories that we read, stories that we write, stories that we tell. And with that, I'd like to invite you to think about the stories that you'd like to recommend, whether you recommend them to the whole room, whether you recommend them to the person sitting next to you at the table. I want you to think about what's on your list. And with that, I'll invite Maria up here to respond. Thank you.
So hello, everyone, and I'd like to thank Albert and the Integritas Institute, of course, for putting this together. I would like to thank all of you for being here, and I would especially like to thank Professor Michelson for a really rich, illuminating, and thought-provoking paper. And there's so much in there that I want to talk about. I am a humanist, I'm a philosopher. You don't have to convince me to read books, but I'm so pleased to have such a great argument for the importance of a liberal arts education and for the importance of reading great works of literature. And so in my response, I want to take just a few minutes, not so much to do anything new or add anything, but to think through some of what I heard today. I'm a philosopher, we make distinctions, make some distinctions. And maybe raise a few questions. I'm not sure. So what I want to do is pick things up at the end with the question of finding appropriate novels for this purpose. And there were these three criteria, the quick and dirty stories. There are these three criteria: length, relevance, and quality. And I won't speak much to length. This is a pragmatic constraint. But I think there are lots of interesting questions that arise when you think about relevance and quality, and whether these two lead to different novels, lead to the same novels in various ways. So what I want to do is think about, one of the things that's so wonderful about the talk, I think, is that we heard so many different ways in which reading novels can contribute to making us better people, better business people, more ethical. And so what I want to do is distinguish between some of these different kinds of contributions, because I think in some cases this contribution might require more quality than relevance, other kinds of contributions might require more relevance than quality, and just think about the space of possibilities for the different ways and kinds of novels and literary devices that we can use. So I'm going to look at just three different ways in which we could think about novels contributing to making us more ethical, creating more ethical business people, be used in a business curriculum. And so one is pretty instrumental, but I still think it's useful, and it isn't one that we really heard a lot about here, but I think it was sort of implicit in what went on, which is that one thing that a novel can do, just in virtue of its length, because it is longer than the typical case study or something, is it can work as a really great case study. So using case studies to help people think through ethical problems in business, bioethics, elsewhere, is a very, very common thing to do. But by design and necessity, case studies are pretty bare bones and pretty artificial and abstract. And that can be really useful because you need to see clearly the structure of an issue and what's pulling you what direction. And looking at just the abstract bare bones thing can be helpful. However, as it turns out, life is a lot messier and more ambiguous than any case study of a page or two is gonna tell you. And what a novel can do is it has the space and time to fill in some of the messiness and the ambiguity and the complexity of real life. And so thinking about the kinds of problems that you might confront in this more extended and leisurely way with more of the, sort of meat of what goes on can be really, really useful. And for that, you're gonna want something that's pretty specific to the kind of question that you're asking. I mean, it has to be something that is directly speaking to a kind of case you want to think about, and so you'll have to find a piece of literature that really does address these kinds of problems directly. But that's a pretty instrumental use, and it's, I think, some of the less interesting uses to which novels can be put, and it's pretty superficial. Now, the other things that we heard, there's sort of two other ways. One has to do with generating empathy. Right? We saw the way in which reading novels can make you more empathetic, can help you understand other points of view. And this, it seems to me, is one of the crucial ways, one of the crucial things that we want novels to do, and certainly one of the ways in which they can make you a better person. And for this purpose, it's not clear that the novel has to be necessarily directly on the topic at hand. It has to be about something that's sort of structurally connected to it. And in fact, in some ways, a novel that is less directly about the question at hand can be more effective in generating empathy because it breaks through your defenses. If someone just tells you about the standard ethical case or the situation, or ethical dilemma that you were anticipating talking about, you've already got your picture of how that's going to go and who everybody is in there. We do tell stories about one another, and they can be hard to break through. But when something is more allegorical, then if you have allegorical reference, it may be more effective. So, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm a sucker for this, and I was really upset about that poor squid. And a squid was not a kind of thing with which I had had a lot of empathy, but when I was thinking of it getting eaten by the lobster bit by bit, I found that pretty upsetting. And then if you read that back into other dealings, when you see the way in which that's structuring your thinking about capitalism or something, having generated that emotion with respect to the squid and reading it back can make you see something in a way you didn't before. And there's all kinds of great examples of this in literature. And so there, it seems, you can get pretty allegorical, right, if you just want people to get empathetic. And really, I think here there's also a more general point about literature and why literary fiction seems to have so much more effect in this way is because one of the things that a good novel will do is not just make you see things from someone else's perspective, but it makes you see things from a lot of perspectives at once. I mean, this is a hallmark of literary narrative that theorists of narrative talk about a lot. If you engage a really good piece of literary fiction, you need to take into account not only the points of view of different characters, which are depicted for you in different ways, but the narrator and the author and your own point of view of the reader. So one of the things that reading literature does is it trains mental muscles that don't get trained other ways. Did my microphone just go off? They're mental muscles that don't get trained in other ways that allow you not just to inhabit other people's points of view, but to think of different points of view all together at once, simultaneously. And so to get a picture of the world as a place in which there are multiple different points of view that are all interacting to make things happen as they do. And this is sort of the theory of mind we were talking about. The recognition, really in a deep and visceral way, that there are a bunch of other people out there who are seeing things in a different way. And this is just perspective giving. But what I think that was in some ways the most complicated, but also the deepest way in which we were hearing about the contribution of novels is the way in which they can transport you to another universe. And in particular, I think what we're being told is they transport you to another moral universe, in the sense that what a great novel can do is build a world for you that you actually inhabit so you can see it and feel it. And it's not just novels. Many works of art can do this. A song can do it. A poem can do it. A painting can do it. But again, it's this perspective giving where you go in there and it's not just some abstract thing. It's not an argument. We can all argue back and forth. But you experience that world, and then that can transform you. That makes you see things. It gives you a kind of experience that you otherwise wouldn't have. And this seems to me really an important and significant piece of the story, but it's also a really complicated one. And when I try to think of the question of, so how do you find the right novels? What is relevance here, right? In the case of transporting you to another moral universe, some interesting questions arise. And in particular, there's this nice ambiguity when you talk about good literature between, do we mean morally good literature, or do we mean aesthetically good literature? And some people would argue these can't come apart. It can't be aesthetically good. It's not really a good work of art if it's morally deficient. But other people say, hey, they come apart all the time. And a standard example of this is the film Triumph of the Will by Lina Wertmüller, right? So people say this is a brilliant piece of filmmaking. It's aesthetically pleasing, but in fact, it's Nazi propaganda, and so morally worrisome. And so what if that can happen? What if you have novels? And so we had, we have an example of I'm reading a novel with such a crappy person in it that it's making me a worse person. And the possibility that you could be transported because novels have this effect on you, and this is one of the things that Plato worried about, right? And one of the reasons that he thought literature was dangerous and we should have argument and we should be objective is that you get transported to some place that's a bad place. And it pulls you in and makes you sympathetic for that perspective. So is that a worry? Is that something we have to worry about? Because if it is, then in choosing books, novels that we want people to read, we have to choose ones that don't just transport you to a moral universe, but to a good moral universe. And then who gets to decide which those are, right? That leaves us a problem of figuring out who gets to make that decision, and if you put it in a curriculum, are you forcing a particular view? But I think that that's a false worry. I mean, I raise it just to say that I think it's a false worry, and I want to say a couple of words just to conclude about why I think it's a false worry. And that the reason that it is I mean, well, there are a couple of reasons. I mean, the first is that, even though novels impact us deeply, it's not brainwashing, right? And a really good work of literature is going to have to be complicated enough that it raises questions. And the examples we were given are not examples where you're just shown this is right and this is wrong. They're examples where you're given a perspective where a question arises for you. But also, I mean, a second reason why I don't think it's a real problem is because obviously if you use the novels in the context of teaching, the whole point of using it, even if it shows an evil and pernicious worldview and makes it delightful, you then have that in front of you to say, how did that happen? How did this evil worldview get made delightful for you? Now you can understand something about the pull or attraction of this kind of view, and then you can ask yourself, well, what's maybe a little bit right about it, and where does it go wrong, and how do we figure out how to, capture what's right without being drawn into what goes wrong. But then another reason why I think this is a false worry, and this is the place where I think the question of what counts as a relevant novel for these purposes and what quality and relevance have to do with one another gets interesting. And that is a lot of what we heard in the talk is not specific to the content of the novel at all. And the reason that we're talking about novels and not, great works of nonfiction, which can also be very useful, or various other ways in which we can learn. The reason that the novel is so important is because of its specifically literary features. And I think one thing we heard about in the talk is all of these different cognitive skills and different patterns of thinking and just ways of approaching the world that you learn from reading novels, and specifically from reading novels. And there are reasons for that, because novels are not, even though they depict things in real life, they may, right? They may tell you, it depends whether you're reading Pynchon or whether you're reading, right, what you're reading, but you may have a story of a very familiar and accessible set of events and circumstances and people. It's a mistake to take that all at face value. Because what's literary about novels is that this is all arranged in a very specific way. If there's a storm in a novel, you better believe that that storm was put there for a purpose by the author to signify something. If there's a storm in real life, it's a meteorological event. If there's an accident or an illness or a reversal of fortune in a novel, it's signifying something beyond itself. So one of the things that novels teach us to do is to think about what things mean, and to think of them as having significance beyond themselves, and to think about what thematic significance things have. And so if you apply that to real life in exactly the same way you do it in a novel, that's going to be pretty strange, right? I mean, if you have the meteorologist coming on the news and saying, well, tonight there's going to be a storm because, you know, the soul of the protagonist is getting dark or something, that's going to be problematic. But if you get into the habit of thinking about the world and the events in it as having significance, this is a way of getting from instrumental value to intrinsic value. It's a way of thinking everything isn't just what it is. There's something more, and there's something, these novels have a moral heft to them, I guess is how I would put it. So one of the things that I want to say is that it seems like a lot of the good that novels are supposed to be doing here comes from them being well-crafted works of literature, because engaging with a well-crafted work of literature just requires a whole different kind of thinking than we are used to when we're doing our instrumental thinking, when we're making just a rational argument or a calculation or doing something very quantitative. And so it makes us sensitive and alive to all these things. And for that purpose, it seems to me, a whole range of novels is useful. I mean, you might have trouble getting people in a business curriculum to read them because they seem so far and so relevant. But at least it speaks for the importance in general of reading novels and so on. And then finally, in terms of just really appreciating a work of novel as a thing that in itself is a giver of joy and pleasure and insight and beauty, that opens you up to a whole range of possibilities. So I guess I just wanted to have some reflection on the different ways in which reading novels can contribute to our thinking about these things, and the different kinds of novels that might do that work. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheckman and Professor Michelson. Now we're going to have a dialogue with the audience, with our two professors, and perhaps the professors can start it off by asking each other questions or getting the ball rolling. But please, Tim is around with the microphone, so just wave if you want to have something to say. And the best way to do this is one of you ask each other a question and get the ball rolling.
Since you talked last, do you mind if I respond a little bit? I think we agree on almost everything. I will say one reason why relevance matters because I agree with you that you can make anything relevant, and but one reason that it matters is to explain to students and to deans of business schools why I'm assigning them this novel.
Yeah. Sure.
Usually my students tell me that I'm their only business professor who's assigning them literature. And I'm aware of that, and I embrace it, and I explain it to them. And if it's a 20-page story, they'll go along with it. If it's a 50-page story, they'll go along with it. I've gotten executive MBA students. These are working professionals who come to school once a month. I've gotten them to read a 700-page novel in a class before. And if I can do that and have them feel like it was relevant and worth their time, I consider that to be a pretty big accomplishment. And it's easier to do that with Bonfire of the Vanities, which is about Wall Street in the 1980s, than it is to do with Frankenstein. And yet, I've had executive MBA students tell me that Frankenstein is the best, most business relevant book that they've ever read. So that's really gratifying. But on this question of, should we worry about who gets to decide which books? You said that you think it's actually a false worry. But you made me think, I understand why you say it's a false worry, but I don't think it's a completely false worry.
Neither do I.
I think that who chooses, especially when it's maybe an authoritarian government censoring books,
Right.
that can have a big impact on what people believe.
Right, so it's only a false worry, I think, if you have a right-minded professor talking it through, right? I mean, if
a
I was thinking,
benevolent dictator.
Right, a benevolent dictator. No, well, really what I was thinking of is in the classroom context. So it is a worry depending on how you're going to use it. So if you use it to inculcate in students a picture of a particular right answer to a moral question, then it is a little worrisome. I mean, you know, more worrisome if I think it's the wrong right answer than if it's the right one, but you know, similarly for people who disagree with me. If you use it as the starting point, so I mean, I guess maybe that's the point I'm trying to make. It's great that you can be transported, but that transporting maybe for the purpose of building character should be a starting point for reflection as opposed to a way to see the answer.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, what your point made me think of in particular was a book that might be on some people's minds in this room, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand.
Oh, there you go.
A 1,000-page book. But at universities around the country, there are centers for the study of American capitalism funded by a Banks Foundation whose purpose is to promote the study of Ayn Rand's books. And Ayn Rand's books promote a certain kind of laissez-faire capitalism that in the book suggests that there are a few people who are the motors of the world and everybody else is sort of a hanger-on. And I think, as you can probably tell, I'm not a big fan of the book. I do think that Atlas Shrugged is a kind of brainwashing that is very attractive to young, ambitious students who want to be the motors of the world. And so I think it can be a bit pervasive and dangerous. And yet I wouldn't censor the reading of it. But one thing that I notice about the book is that it's actually not a very good work of literature. Like the characters are two-dimensional. You can't really empathize with them unless you really want to. It's kind of interesting because it's the favorite book of several important capitalists. One is Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve. He says that Ayn Rand taught him how to think. Howard Lutnick, the president and chairman of the investment firm, or the bond trading firm Cantor Fitzgerald, he, in an interview with USA Today, called Atlas Shrugged his favorite book. And then Henry Allison, the former chairman of BB&T Bank, used to give copies to his management team of Atlas Shrugged. It's not just Atlas Shrugged, by the way. I remember in a comparative literature class reading not only Atlas Shrugged, but also Ilya Ehrenberg's The Second Day, a Soviet-era book about how productive our manufacturing plants were. And it was sort of embraced by the government as a way of building enthusiasm for the planned economy. And like Atlas Shrugged, it's just not a very good book.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting listening to you guys. I never made it through Atlas Shrugged, but I read The Fountainhead at an impressionable age and was just, you know, like mesmerized by it. I just thought, and then I got over it. And I agree with you, and I'm wondering, since, you know, I don't tend to read as many novels as I should with points of view I really disagree with, you know, advocating or depicting. But I wonder if it's true that we can come up with a set of aesthetic criteria whereby we can rule out books that have worldviews we don't like.
Yeah, right.
So I mean, and maybe that's just a way of saying that in some ways there's reason to focus more on the kind of broader skill set. I mean, not for the reasons you say when you've got one class and you have busy people and you have to give them something that they understand why you're assigning it. So not in that context, but just more broadly, the books should open worlds, but then you should see that there are multiple worlds, and again, it should be a broader liberal arts education that gives you the tools to critically evaluate what you just read.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I'm starting to scare myself because I think I'm starting to sound like an authoritarian dictator. I'm kind of curious whether anybody in the audience has an opinion on who has the authority to decide what is good.
I also believe that society as a whole, it's who decides what's good and what's wrong. Like society makes the standard and they will decide what's good and what's wrong, and if it's accepted by that society, then it will be good. If it's not, then it will be bad.
And those are two really interesting views, and while the microphone moves over there, I'll just say the first view, that is definitely not the students, suggests that we, the professors, are fountains of knowledge that pour knowledge into your minds, and you accept that from us. And I think that most of us don't want to feel that way, that we are the knowledgeable ones and you are not. I'd rather, even though I sound a little authoritarian, I'd rather engage in a dialogue with you. I'd rather learn from you as much as you are learning from me. And that sort of implies maybe something similar to the second response, that it's the society that collectively decides. That's sort of a democratic view, but there are also some philosophical landmines in that answer too, with regard to cultural relativism, for example.
To speak to the first point about how it's not the students, I respectfully disagree completely. Just given that in regards to the second opinion about how society determines what's good, we also need to determine what's bad because we need both ends of the spectrum. And I would say that anyone who is in an authority figure in this society that's seemingly democratic is that people who determine who's in an authority figure have chosen this authority figure for a certain reason. So this authority figure, I would hope, is also a student themselves. They may not have this label, as mentioned earlier, of being a student, but they obviously had to learn something along the way to have the position that they had. If anyone would like to go off of that.
Yeah. And just while the microphone's moving, I mean, I think in response to both of those, and what I was trying to say when I was saying, you know, maybe we don't have to be afraid too much, is that, I mean, I think Frankenstein is a great example, because on the one hand, there's a clear-cut moral perspective. I mean, there's a moral of that story. It's not open for discussion whether it's a good thing to make something and then not worry about its effects and so on. But on the other hand, it gives you a sort of emotional argument for that, but it's one that you can step back from and say, I mean, you can think about it. I mean, it raises questions. What does it mean when you do this? What could have been done differently? How could you do it, right? So there's a sense in which it doesn't just tell you this is the right perspective. It's saying, let me paint you a picture of what happens when you take this perspective. And if you are someone who takes that perspective, it doesn't tell you don't take it necessarily. It says be thoughtful about where you're going and what the implications will be and whether you accept them or not. So, I mean, maybe that's a...
Hello. Yeah, going back onto the question, I think the people who decide what a good book is the actual reader, because each reader intakes the knowledge differently, and it actually depends on whether or not they comprehend the message from the book. So each book will react to them differently, so the reader themselves decides whether or not they can actually relate to the book and intake the information. So the reader decides what a good book is.
You know, that's a really interesting point, and it reminds me of a point in modern criticism that we actually kind of create the work of art as we interpret it, because we each have a different relationship to it.
Beauty, as he said somewhat, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. That's all.
So that takes it to an extreme, right? That there are no objective shared criteria, not even social criteria of beauty. And I tend to be sympathetic to that view up to a point. I think one thing that's happening here is that we're having a dialogue about what is good, what is beautiful, what matters, who gets to decide. And I think that's part of the point, is that works of art, novels included, sort of engender that kind of dialogue. I'm even willing, if there's somebody out there, to be convinced that I'm dead wrong about Atlas Shrugged, by the way. If I'm going to celebrate dialogue, I have to be willing to celebrate the possibility that I may be wrong.
And I think that I feel like the music is going to start. I also think, I mean, maybe that's one way, though, of thinking about what novels can really do for you. Because even if you think beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, sometimes someone can get you to behold something in a way you didn't before. So, you know, I go and see splotches of paint on a canvas, but someone who knows a lot about modern art sits there and shows me things that I hadn't seen, and suddenly I see a really interesting, beautiful work. And I think that that's what novels can do with other moral frameworks or ways of life that are incomprehensible to you until someone can show you what's beautiful in them. So it opens up your vistas that way.
Thank you very much, professors. We are about to transition to lunch and our lunchtime panel. This has been a very interesting conversation of how to frame works of literature within a business ethics setting. And a number of very interesting questions have been raised. We're going to transition to the world of working business ethics with some business practitioners who will tell their own stories. And Professor Michelson will sit in on that panel as well. And Professor Sheckman, thank you very much for your time this morning. We'll thank Professor Michelson afterwards because we're going to keep him working.